Windsor Great Park. Nestled among the thick forest, almost invisible to the naked eye, lies a secret the British royal family once forgotten. Fort Belvedere, a gothic folly shrouded in mystery and scandal, was the scene of one of the monarchy's darkest hours. Here, in this secluded palace, King Edward VIII signed away the British Empire and began a love affair with Wallace Simpson that would forever change history. But it wasn't just the abdication that made this place infamous. It was what went on behind closed doors. The Nazi sympathizers, the ignoring of government warnings, and the looming threat of war that could have shattered the monarchy itself. What happened within these walls has been buried until now. Chapter 1. The Dream That Demanded Everything. Edward was never meant to be king, yet it was in his dream to wear the crown that he would lose everything. Born on June the 23rd, 1894, the Edward Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick. David entered the world as the eldest son of the Duke of York. His arrival was celebrated across the British Empire, but the weight of expectation settled on his shoulders before he could even walk. They called him David within the family, a name softer than the titles that would follow: Prince of Wales, King Emperor. Names that carried the burden of an empire spanning 1/4 of the Earth's surface. His childhood was not one of warmth. King George V, his father, ruled the palace with military discipline. Breakfast at 8, lessons until noon, physical training in the afternoon. The young prince grew up in a world of rigid schedules and formal ceremonies, where affection was rationed like wartime supplies. His mother, Queen Mary, was equally distant, a woman of duty rather than maternal tenderness. Edward learned early that love was something other families possessed. He was handsome, golden-haired, with eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual sadness. As he grew, he became the most photographed man in the world. Women adored him. The press followed his every movement. He represented a modern monarchy, one that could dance and smile and wear fashionable clothes. But behind the charm lay a deep well of loneliness, a void that no amount of public adoration could fill. The Great War changed him. He served, though not on the front lines. The palace wouldn't risk the air. He visited hospitals, shook hands with soldiers, saw the mangled bodies and haunted faces of men who had given everything for king and country. He began to question the system that demanded such sacrifice. What was the point of an empire built on the bones of the working class? What right did he have to luxury while others died in mud-filled trenches? By 1920, at age 26, Edward was the most eligible bachelor in the world. He had affairs, discreet and otherwise. Married women mostly. Safe relationships that couldn't lead to marriage. He wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for escape from duty, from expectation, from the suffocating weight of being the future king. His father despised his lifestyle, the parties, the jazz music, the American friends. George V believed in the old ways, the strict moral code that had governed the monarchy for generations. Father and son fought constantly. You dress like a cad. You behave like a fool. You will bring shame to this family. The king's words cut deep, reinforcing Edward's belief that he would never be good enough, never measure up to the impossible standards set before him. Fort Belvedere entered his life in 1929. He was 35 years old and desperate for a place of his own. Not a palace, not a residence filled with servants who reported to his father. A retreat, somewhere he could be himself, whatever that meant. The building stood in Windsor Great Park, a pseudo-Gothic fantasy constructed in the 1730s. It had been neglected for decades, its rooms dusty and cold, its gardens overgrown with brambles and weeds. Edward saw potential. He saw freedom. He leased the property from his father and began transforming it into his personal sanctuary. He worked in the gardens himself, cutting back ivy, planting flowers, creating pathways through the wilderness. Physical labor became therapy. Each hour spent digging or pruning was an hour away from royal duties, away from the judgment of the court. The fort became his obsession. He installed modern plumbing and central heating. He decorated the rooms in his own style, not the heavy Victorian aesthetic his parents preferred. Light colors, simple furniture, American jazz records on the gramophone. Here, he could breathe. Here, he could pretend he was someone else, a country gentleman, a man of leisure, anyone but the Prince of Wales. But the dream was incomplete. The fort was beautiful, his gardens were thriving, yet something essential was missing. He was still alone, still searching for the one thing the monarchy had never taught him how to find. Love. Real, unconditional, transformative love. The kind that novels described and songs celebrated. He wanted to be chosen, not because of his title, but in spite of it. He had no idea that his search would lead to catastrophe, that the woman who would fill the void in his heart would also tear apart the very foundation of the institution he was born to serve. The dream that demanded everything was about to exact its price. Chapter 2. A Kingdom in the Shadows. Fort Belvedere, a place built for solitude, became the dark stage where Edward's royal dream unraveled. The building rose from the edge of Virginia water like something from a Gothic novel. 3 stories of golden stone, encastellated towers reaching toward the sky, mullioned windows reflecting the surrounding forest. It was theatrical architecture, a folly designed to evoke medieval grandeur without any of the defensive practicality. William, Duke of Cumberland, had commissioned it in 1750, a playground for a prince who would never wear the crown. The location was deliberate, hidden from the main roads, accessible only by private drives through dense woodland. Fort Belvedere existed in its own world. You could stand in its gardens and hear nothing but birdsong and wind through trees. No traffic, no crowds, no reminders of the modern world pressing in from all sides. For Edward, this isolation was intoxicating. He spent weekends there, escaping from his official residence at York House in London. Friday evenings, he would drive through the park gates, feel his shoulders relax as the city fell away behind him. The fort had 20 rooms spread across its compact footprint, not vast by royal standards. The drawing room could seat 20 people comfortably. The dining room held a table for 12. Upstairs, 6 bedrooms, each with views across the artificial lake that stretched away to the south. Edward transformed the interiors to match his American-influenced taste. He ripped out the dark wood paneling, painted walls in cream and pale blue. He installed a modern bathroom with running hot water, a luxury even some London hotels couldn't match in the early 1930s. The furnishings were comfortable rather than grand. Deep sofas, thick carpets, reading lamps positioned for actual reading, not just decoration. The gardens became his masterpiece. He hired professional landscapers, but did much of the work himself. There are photographs from this period showing the Prince of Wales in shirt sleeves, wielding a spade, dirt under his fingernails. He created a rock garden, importing stones from across Britain. He planted rhododendrons and azaleas, their blooms creating explosions of color each spring. He built a swimming pool, one of the first private pools in Britain, a concrete rectangle filled with heated water where he could swim laps while the rest of the country shivered through winter. The fort cost him roughly £10,000 per year to maintain. His annual income from the Duchy of Cornwall exceeded £100,000, so the expense was manageable. But it wasn't about the money, it was about control. This was his project, his vision, his escape from a life orchestrated by others. He hosted parties there, small gatherings of friends from London society, Americans mostly, people who didn't bow and scrape, who called him David and laughed at his jokes without calculation. The evenings followed a pattern: cocktails at 7, dinner at 8:30, dancing to gramophone records until midnight. Then cards or conversation, the guests scattered across sofas while Edward mixed drinks behind a portable bar he'd installed in the drawing room. These gatherings scandalized the traditional elements of British society. A prince serving drinks like a common bartender, a prince associating with divorced women and American businessmen. The whispers reached Buckingham Palace regularly. King George V disapproved. Queen Mary was appalled. But Edward didn't care. Or perhaps he cared too much, using the fort as a stage for rebellion against everything his parents represented. The building itself seemed to absorb this tension. Its walls witnessed Edward's transformation from dutiful son to defiant prince. The rooms held conversations about everything the monarchy avoided: politics, sexuality, the changing world order. Within the fort's stone embrace, Edward could question whether the empire had any future. Whether monarchy itself was an outdated institution clinging to relevance in an age of democracies and dictators. But there was darkness there too, a sense of things hidden, of secrets kept from the prying eyes of the press and public. The fort sat on the edge of the park, visible only to those who knew where to look. It was a liminal space, neither fully public nor entirely private. Servants moved through its corridors, observing everything, reporting back to the palace. Edward knew he was watched, even here. His sanctuary was also his prison. The architecture reinforced this duality. The towers suggested defense, protection from attack. But the windows were large and exposed, offering no real security. The walls were thick but decorative, incapable of withstanding any genuine assault. Fort Belvedere was a performance of strength, not the reality. Much like the monarchy itself. Much like Edward's own carefully constructed persona. By 1934, the fort had become inseparable from Edward's identity. When people spoke of the prince, they spoke of his obsession with the building and grounds. He's always there on weekends, they would say, working in the gardens, swimming in that pool. It's unnatural, really. A prince should be in London, fulfilling his duties. Instead, he hides in Windsor Forest like some hermit. The criticism missed the point. Edward wasn't hiding from duty. He was hiding from himself, from the knowledge that he didn't want the life he'd been born into. From the terrifying suspicion that when his father died and he became king, he would be crushed under the weight of the crown. Fort Belvedere was his preparation for a future he both craved and feared. a kingdom in the shadows, a place where he could practice being himself before the world demanded he become someone else entirely. Chapter 3. The Rise of Wallace Simpson. Wallace Simpson's arrival in Edward's life was not fate, it was a revolution. She was born Bessie Wallace Warfield on June 19, 1896, in Pennsylvania. Not wealthy, not aristocratic, not even particularly beautiful by the standards of the day. Her face was angular, her figure slim without curves, her voice carrying the flat vowels of Baltimore. By the time she met Edward in 1931, she had been married twice. The first marriage ended in divorce. The second, to Ernest Simpson, a British-American shipping executive, was still technically intact. They were introduced at a house party. Edward barely noticed her. She was one of many Americans in London society, wives of businessmen who hovered at the edges of aristocratic circles. But she possessed something that caught his attention during their second meeting: confidence. She didn't simper or flatter. She spoke to him as an equal, teasing him about his fondness for American jazz and challenging his opinions on politics and art. For a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by sycophants, this was revolutionary. Wallace treated him like a person, not a prince. She argued with him, contradicted him, laughed at his jokes only when they were actually funny. He found himself seeking her company, inviting her and Ernest to Fort Belvedere for weekends, seating her next to him at dinners. By 1934, their relationship had shifted from friendship to something more dangerous. Ernest Simpson began to notice the way Edward looked at his wife, the way Edward monopolized her attention at parties, the way Edward's face lit up when Wallace entered a room. He was losing her, slowly but inevitably, to a man whose position made competition impossible. Wallace was not swept away by romance. She was calculating, aware of the opportunity Edward represented. Not for the throne. She knew a divorced American could never be queen, but for security, for status, for escape from a middle-class existence she had always resented. She encouraged Edward's affection while maintaining enough distance to keep him desperate. She accepted expensive gifts. She allowed him to pay for her vacations. She let him believe she might love him back. Edward fell completely. This wasn't infatuation, it was obsession. He wrote her letters daily, sometimes twice a day, pouring out his loneliness and need. He telephoned her at all hours. He rearranged his schedule to accommodate her slightest whim. His staff watched in horror as the Prince of Wales transformed into a lovesick boy, chasing a woman who by every metric was entirely unsuitable. Fort Belvedere became their private world. They spent weekends there together, Ernest initially present as a convenient cover, later simply absent. Wallace took over the running of the household, directing the servants, planning menus, rearranging furniture to suit her taste. Edward was delighted. Finally, someone who cared about his home as much as he did. Someone who saw Fort Belvedere not as an eccentric indulgence, but as a refuge worth protecting. The British establishment began to panic. King George V heard rumors about his son's attachment to Mrs. Simpson and summoned Edward to Buckingham Palace. "This cannot continue. She is entirely unsuitable. You will end this relationship immediately." And Edward refused. For the first time in his life, he stood up to his father. He loved Wallace. He would not give her up, not for the crown, not for anything. The king's health was failing. He died on January 20th, 1936, leaving Edward as King Edward VIII. The new monarch was 41 years old and more in love with Wallace Simpson than ever. He believed he could have both, the throne and the woman. He believed the government would accept her, that the public would understand, that love could conquer the institutional barriers erected by centuries of tradition. He was catastrophically wrong. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made the situation clear. Wallis Simpson could not be queen. She was divorced, not once, but twice. The Church of England, of which Edward was now the head, did not recognize divorce. The Dominions, Canada and Australia and New Zealand, would never accept her. If Edward insisted on marrying Mrs. Simpson, and he would have to choose between the crown and the woman. Wallis became a prisoner of the situation she had helped create. The press began to notice the relationship. Photographers followed her through London. Journalists dug into her past, uncovered unflattering details, published speculation about her motives. Was she a gold digger, a manipulator, an American adventuress determined to snare a king? The scrutiny was relentless and cruel. Edward's response was to retreat further into Fort Belvedere. He brought Wallis there and refused to let her leave. It was the only place they could be together without cameras and reporters crowding around. The servants whispered about what they saw. The King and Mrs. Simpson taking walks through the gardens, swimming together in the pool, dining alone by candlelight. It was romantic and doomed in equal measure. The constitutional crisis deepened throughout 1936, and Edward refused to give up Wallis. The government refused to accept her. The impasse seemed unbreakable. Behind closed doors at Fort Belvedere, Edward and Wallis argued. She wanted him to fight harder. He wanted her to understand the impossible position he was in. Both were trapped by forces larger than themselves. In November, Wallis filed for divorce from Ernest Simpson. The decree would be final in 6 months. Edward took this as a sign that she was committed to him, that they could weather the storm together. He told Baldwin he intended to marry her as soon as the divorce was complete. The Prime Minister warned that such a marriage would force his resignation and likely bring down the government. Edward said he didn't care. But Wallis was beginning to understand the price they would pay. She would never be accepted by British society. She would always be the woman who stole the king. Her name would be synonymous with scandal and shame. She suggested to Edward that they wait, that they give the public time to adjust. Edward wouldn't hear of it. He had waited long enough. He wanted her now, wanted marriage now, wanted a life they could share openly without hiding at Fort Belvedere like criminals. The revolution Wallis had started was consuming them both. She had wanted security and status. Instead, she had become the most hated woman in Britain. He had wanted love and freedom. Instead, and he was about to lose the throne he had spent 41 years preparing to inherit. Fort Belvedere, their sanctuary, had become the eye of a storm that would reshape the British monarchy forever. Chapter 4: The Abdication Crisis. On December 11th, 1936, Edward made a decision that no king before him had ever dared to make. The preceding weeks had been a nightmare of constitutional wrangling and public pressure. The British press, which had maintained a gentleman's agreement to avoid mentioning Wallace Simpson, finally broke their silence in early December. The headlines were brutal. King's morganatic marriage plan. Mrs. Simpson will not be queen. American divorcee threatens throne. Suddenly, the entire country knew about the relationship that had been an open secret in aristocratic circles for 2 years. Edward had proposed a solution, a morganatic marriage. Wallis would become his wife, but not queen, and any children they had would not inherit the throne. It was a compromise that existed in some European monarchies, a way to marry below one's station without threatening the succession. The cabinet rejected it immediately. British law did not recognize morganatic marriages. Creating a new category of royal wife specifically for Mrs. Simpson would require legislation that Parliament would never pass. The king retreated to Fort Belvedere. He couldn't face London. I couldn't endure the stares and whispers at Buckingham Palace. The fort was the only place that still felt safe. But even there, the walls were closing in. Advisors arrived daily, presenting documents, outlining options, explaining why every path forward seemed blocked. The Archbishop of Canterbury came to make a final appeal: your duty to the Church, your duty to the Empire, your duty to God. Edward listened politely and showed him to the door. Wallis was staying at the fort during these final days. She could see Edward unraveling. He barely slept, barely ate. He paced the rooms like a caged animal, smoking cigarette after cigarette, drinking whiskey to dull the anxiety. She tried to comfort him, but her presence was part of the problem. Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of what he stood to lose. Not Wallis, the crown, the identity he had been raised to assume. The government presented their ultimatum: give up Mrs. Simpson or abdicate. There was no third option, no compromise, no way forward that allowed him to keep both the throne and the woman. Edward asked for time. He needed to think, needed to discuss the situation with Wallis, needed to pray, though he wasn't a religious man, for some miracle that would solve the impossible equation. On the evening of December 10th, Edward sat in the drawing room at Fort Belvedere with Walter Monckton, his legal advisor and closest friend. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, winter darkness had fallen across the park. Monckton had prepared the abdication documents. All that remained was Edward's signature. Once he signed, he would cease to be king. His brother Bertie would become George VI. Edward would become the Duke of Windsor, a prince without purpose, a king who had chosen love over duty. Edward picked up the pen. His hand shook. He had been raised to believe the monarchy was sacred, that the crown was a divine responsibility that transcended personal desire. Everything he had been taught, everything his father had drilled into him, screamed that he was making a catastrophic mistake. Kings did not abandon their thrones. Kings sacrificed their happiness for the good of the nation. Kings put duty above all else. But he wasn't thinking about duty. He was thinking about Wallis, about the way she made him feel seen and valued, about the possibility of a life lived for himself rather than for an institution he had never fully believed in, about escape from a role that had always felt like a costume he couldn't remove. He was thinking about Fort Belvedere, about the gardens he had planted, about the sanctuary he had created, about having a real home with the woman he loved, rather than a collection of palaces where he was always on display. He signed the document, 6 copies, his signature barely legible through the tremor in his hand. Edward Rex, King Edward, for a few more hours at least. The ink dried, the die was cast. He had done it, abdicated, surrendered the British Empire for love, or for freedom. or for some combination of both that he didn't fully understand himself. The news reached London within the hour. The cabinet met in emergency session. The dominions were informed by telegram. Across the empire, millions of people learned that their king had chosen a twice-divorced American woman over the throne. The reactions ranged from sympathy to fury. Some saw it as the ultimate romantic gesture. Others saw it as betrayal, abandonment, dereliction of duty on a scale never before witnessed. Edward had to leave Britain. That was part of the agreement. He would go into exile until the situation calmed down, until the press stopped hounding him and Wallace, until his brother could establish himself as the new king without the shadow of the abdication hanging over every public appearance. The plan was for Edward to go to Austria, to stay with friends there while Wallace's divorce became final and they could marry. On December 11th, he broadcast a farewell address to the nation from Windsor Castle. The speech had been written by himself with help from Winston Churchill. It was broadcast live on radio to the largest audience in British history. Edward sat before the microphone, his brother, the new king, beside him, and spoke the words that would define his legacy. At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor. You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne. I want you to understand that in making up my mind, I did not forget the country or the empire. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. His voice was steady, but thick with emotion. Millions listened in stunned silence. The king who had given up his kingdom, the man who had chosen personal happiness over duty. Now, history would judge whether he had made the right choice. But in that moment, listening to his voice carried across the airwaves, many people felt a strange admiration. He had been honest. He had chosen love. In a world increasingly dominated by ideology and power politics, there was something almost noble about a man who walked away from supreme authority for the sake of his heart. Edward returned to Fort Belvedere after the broadcast. Wallace was there waiting. They held each other in the drawing room, the same room where he had signed away the throne, and wept. Not from sadness, from relief. It was over. The crisis had passed. They had survived. Now they could begin the life they had both imagined. A life of freedom, a life together, a life that would prove to be far more complicated and painful than either of them could have predicted. Chapter 5. Behind closed doors, the Nazi sympathizers. Within the walls of Fort Belvedere, the whispers of betrayal were louder than the cries for loyalty. Edward's political views had always been unconventional for a member of the royal family. He sympathized with the working class, visited coal mines and slums, spoke publicly about the need for social reform. But his progressivism on domestic issues coexisted with a troubling admiration for authoritarian regimes abroad, particularly Germany, particularly the National Socialist government that had come to power in 1933 under Adolf Hitler. The attraction was partly aesthetic. Edward had visited Germany multiple times in the 1920s and early 30s. He was impressed by the order, the efficiency, the sense of national purpose that seemed to pervade the country under Nazi rule. The autobahns stretched across the landscape like monuments to modernity. The youth organizations promoted physical fitness and discipline. The economy was recovering from the hyperinflation and chaos of the Weimar years. To Edward, who saw Britain as stagnant and class-bound, Germany appeared to be embracing the future. But his interest went deeper than admiration for infrastructure projects. Edward believed war between Britain and Germany would be catastrophic. He had seen the carnage of the Great War, remembered the hospitals filled with broken men, the cemeteries that stretched to the horizon. Another conflict would destroy European civilization. Peace had to be maintained at any cost. And if peace required accommodating Hitler's territorial ambitions, well, perhaps that was a price worth paying. These views were shared by a significant faction of the British aristocracy in the mid-1930s. The horror of the Great War was still fresh. The Soviet Union represented a greater threat to the established order than fascism, a better Hitler than Stalin, many believed, better authoritarianism than communism, better a strong Germany than a Bolshevik Europe. These were the arguments Edward heard at dinner parties, in private clubs, during weekends at Fort Belvedere. The fort became a gathering place for those sympathetic to Germany. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador to Britain, was a frequent guest. He arrived with his entourage, charming and urbane, speaking perfect English, discussing art and music and the possibilities for improved Anglo-German relations. He brought messages from Hitler, expressions of goodwill, suggestions that Edward could play a crucial role in preventing future conflict. Von Ribbentrop understood Edward's psychology perfectly. The prince, and later the king, craved validation. He wanted to be seen as more than a ceremonial figurehead. He wanted to matter, to shape events, to use his position for something meaningful, and von Ribbentrop offered that opportunity. You could be the bridge between our nations. You could prevent war. You alone have the standing and the vision to make peace possible. Edward listened and believed. Wallis complicated the situation. She was not particularly political, but she recognized power when she saw it. The Germans courted her as enthusiastically as they courted Edward. They sent her flowers and gifts. They invited her to receptions. They treated her with the respect and deference that British society denied her. She responded by encouraging Edward's pro-German sympathies. Why shouldn't Britain seek accommodation with Germany? Why should young men die for abstract principles when diplomacy could preserve peace? The British government was aware of Edward's leanings. Intelligence services monitored his contacts with German officials. Cabinet members received reports about conversations at Fort Belvedere, and Prime Minister Baldwin was deeply concerned. A king sympathetic to Nazi Germany posed a security risk of the highest order. Edward had access to state secrets, military plans, diplomatic correspondence. If he shared any of that information with German contacts, intentionally or otherwise, the consequences could be catastrophic. After the abdication, Edward's German connections became even more problematic. No longer constrained by constitutional duties, he felt free to pursue his vision of Anglo-German reconciliation. In October 1937, less than a year after giving up the throne, Edward and Wallis visited Germany as guests of the Nazi regime. The trip was ostensibly private, but it was stage-managed by Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, to maximum effect. Edward toured factories and workers' housing. He met with Nazi officials and inspected SS units. He gave the Nazi salute repeatedly, captured in photographs that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Most significantly, he met with Hitler at the Berghof, the Führer's mountain retreat. The meeting lasted over an hour. No British officials were present. No official record was kept. But witnesses reported that Edward and Hitler discussed the possibility of Edward being restored to the British throne if Germany and Britain reached an understanding. The visit was a propaganda coup for the Nazis. Look, they could say, even the former King of Britain recognizes the righteousness of our cause. The international press coverage was extensive and almost uniformly negative. What was Edward thinking? How could he lend legitimacy to a regime that was openly anti-Semitic, militaristic, and expansionist? The British government was furious. The palace was mortified. Edward's brother, the new king, was humiliated. Fort Belvedere, meanwhile, remained Edward's legal residence even after he went into exile. The building stood empty for months at a time, the servants maintaining the grounds and rooms in case Edward returned. But the fort's reputation was forever tainted by the guests who had walked its corridors during Edward's tenure. Von Ribbentrop's visits were public knowledge. Other, more shadowy figures had also been entertained there. German intelligence officers, Nazi sympathizers from British fascist movements, people who saw the fort not as a romantic retreat, but as a potential base for pro-German operations. The full extent of Edward's collaboration with Nazi Germany remains unclear. Documents were destroyed. Conversations were held in private. The British government suppressed information after the war to protect the monarchy's reputation. But enough evidence exists to paint a troubling picture. Edward was not a committed fascist. He was a naive idealist who believed he could personally prevent another war. But naivety at that level of power can be as dangerous as malice. The whispers of betrayal that echoed through Fort Belvedere were not entirely baseless. Edward had betrayed his duty as king by abdicating. Some argued he had also betrayed his country by entertaining and encouraging the enemy. The fort, his beloved sanctuary, became a symbol of that potential treachery. A place where loyalty to Britain took second place to personal ambition and romantic fantasy. A place where the walls, if they could speak, would tell stories the monarchy desperately needed to keep silent. Chapter 6. The Royal Ignorance of War. While Europe marched toward war, the monarchy remained silent, encapsulated in the comfort of Fort Belvedere. The late 1930s were a time of gathering storms. Hitler annexed Austria in March 1938. 6 months later, he demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and returned with a piece of paper promising peace in our time. But anyone paying attention understood that war was inevitable. Germany was rearming at a furious pace. The Luftwaffe grew stronger each month. The Wehrmacht expanded. Nazi ideology spoke openly of Lebensraum, living space, which could only be obtained through conquest. Britain began to prepare. Factories converted to military production. Young men registered for potential conscription. Air raid shelters appeared in London parks. The government distributed gas masks to civilians. The sense of impending catastrophe hung over the country like fog. Everyone knew what was coming. The only question was when. Edward and Wallis seemed oblivious. They had married in June 1937 at a private ceremony in France. The British royal family refused to attend. No member of the aristocracy sent congratulations. The Church of England declined to recognize the marriage. Edward was heartbroken by the snub, but Wallis tried to make the best of it. They were together. They were free. They could build a life on their own terms. But what life? Edward had no role, no purpose. He was a king without a kingdom, a prince without duties. He and Wallis divided their time between rented houses in France and occasional visits to Fort Belvedere when British public opinion had cooled enough to allow it. They threw parties, they traveled, they spent money with abandon, drawing on Edward's investments and the allowance his brother provided. It was a hollow existence, elegant and aimless. Fort Belvedere remained their touchstone. Whenever they returned to Britain, they retreated to the fort's familiar rooms. The gardens Edward had planted continued to bloom each spring. The swimming pool still sparkled in summer sunlight. The building seemed frozen in time, preserved exactly as it had been during the Abdication Crisis. Walking through its corridors was like stepping into the past, into those final weeks when Edward had still been king and the future had seemed full of possibility. But the world outside the fort's walls was changing rapidly. Intelligence reports indicated that Germany planned to invade Poland. The French were fortifying the Maginot Line. The Soviet Union was positioning itself to exploit whatever chaos ensued. Britain was rearming, but remained unprepared for total war. The government needed unity, needed the public to accept sacrifice, needed every person in the country to understand the gravity of the situation. Edward could have helped. As a former king, he retained enormous public affection. His radio addresses could have rallied the nation. His appearances at factories and military bases could have boosted morale. His connections across Europe could have provided valuable intelligence. But he chose not to engage. He had abdicated not just the throne, but any sense of obligation to his country. He was done with duty, done with sacrifice, done with subordinating his desires to the national interest. Wallis reinforced this attitude. She had no loyalty to Britain. She was American. Technically, though she had lived abroad for so long that she felt disconnected from her homeland as well. She urged Edward to focus on themselves, on their marriage, on building a life that brought them happiness rather than stress. Why should they involve themselves in European politics? Edward had given up the throne precisely to escape such burdens. Now the government wanted to drag him back into service? Absolutely not. The British establishment was horrified. Winston Churchill, who had supported Edward during the Abdication Crisis, tried to convince him to return to Britain and take up some official role. "The country needs you," Churchill argued. "Your brother is doing his best, but he lacks your charisma, your connection with ordinary people. You could be invaluable in the coming struggle." Edward politely declined. He and Wallis were happy in France. They saw no reason to return. This indifference to the approaching catastrophe revealed something essential about Edward's character. He was not a bad man. He was a selfish one. His entire life had been shaped by his desire for personal happiness. When that desire conflicted with duty, happiness won. When that desire conflicted with national interest, happiness won. He simply could not conceive of sacrificing his comfort for abstract principles like patriotism or loyalty. Fort Belvedere stood as a monument to this selfishness. Edward had created it as a refuge from responsibility. Now, as Europe prepared for the most destructive war in human history, the fort remained a symbol of withdrawal, of turning away from the world's problems to focus on personal concerns. The gardens bloomed, the pool shimmered. Inside, the rooms waited for their owner's return, while outside, the world burned. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Britain declared war 2 days later. The Second World War had begun. It would last 6 years and kill 60 million people. It would reduce cities to rubble, send millions to concentration camps, culminate in the use of atomic weapons. It would reshape the global order and mark the beginning of the end for the British Empire. Edward and Wallis heard the news in France. They were shocked, despite all the warnings. Somehow, they had convinced themselves that war could be avoided, that diplomacy would prevail, that Hitler's ambitions could be satisfied without bloodshed. Their ignorance was willful, a deliberate choice to ignore reality in favor of comfortable fantasy. Fort Belvedere had trained them well. Within its walls, the world's problems could be kept at bay. Now, they discovered that isolation was no longer possible. The German army swept through France in May 1940. Edward and Wallis fled south, barely ahead of the advancing troops. They made their way to Spain, then Portugal, uncertain of their future. The British government eventually arranged for them to go to the Bahamas, where Edward was appointed governor. It was a humiliating posting, a tropical exile designed to keep him far from Europe and unable to cause political damage. Fort Belvedere was locked up. The servants were dismissed. The gardens fell into neglect. As war raged across Europe, as London burned under German bombs, as British soldiers died on beaches and in deserts, the fort stood empty, a monument to privilege and willful blindness, a reminder of what happens when those in power choose comfort over courage. A dark chapter the monarchy would spend decades trying to forget. Chapter 7: The Monarchy's Fall from Grace. The day Edward abdicated, he not only abandoned the throne, he abandoned the very essence of the monarchy. George VI, Edward's younger brother, never wanted to be king. He was shy, plagued by a severe stutter, more comfortable with his family than with state ceremonies. He had been raised as a spare, the backup plan in case something happened to Edward. Now, at age 41, he found himself thrust into the role of monarch with no preparation and no warning. The abdication had left him terrified and furious in equal measure. The British public struggled to process what had happened. For centuries, the monarchy had been built on duty and sacrifice. Kings and queens subordinated personal desires to the needs of the nation. They married for political advantage. They produced heirs. They presided over ceremonies and provided stability. The institution's legitimacy rested on the idea that royals were different from ordinary people, that they accepted burdens common citizens would never bear. Edward had shattered that narrative. He had proven that even a king could prioritize personal happiness over duty. He had shown that the monarchy was not sacred, not eternal, not immune to the same passions and weaknesses that affected everyone else. His abdication made the institution seem fragile, perhaps even unnecessary. If a king could simply walk away when duty became inconvenient, what was the point of monarchy at all? The damage to royal prestige was immense and immediate. Newspaper editorials questioned whether Britain needed a king. Republican movements gained new members. Public opinion polls showed declining support for the monarchy, particularly among younger people who saw Edward's choice as admirably modern rather than shamefully irresponsible. The empire itself seemed to waver. If the king didn't believe the crown was worth keeping, why should the dominions maintain their allegiance to it? George VI worked desperately to repair the damage. He and his wife Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, presented themselves as the anti-Edward. Where Edward had been glamorous and fashionable, George was stolid and traditional. Where Edward had courted publicity, George maintained dignified privacy. Where Edward had been selfish, George emphasized duty and service. The message was clear. The aberration was over. The monarchy was back on its proper foundation. But the foundation had been cracked. People had seen behind the curtain. They understood that royalty was a performance, a carefully constructed image designed to maintain power and privilege. Edward's abdication had exposed the machinery behind the magic. Restoring public faith would take years of careful work and substantial luck. Fort Belvedere became a problem the palace didn't know how to solve. The building was legally Edward's property, leased from the Crown estate. But it carried associations the new king wanted to eliminate. Edward and Wallis, the abdication, the Nazi sympathies. Yet every time the press mentioned Fort Belvedere, they dredged up memories George VI desperately wanted the public to forget. He considered buying out Edward's lease and demolishing the building. But that seemed too aggressive, too obvious an attempt to erase history. Instead, the fort was simply ignored. During the war years, it stood empty. After the war, when Edward offered to return to Britain and resume residence there, the palace refused. "You are not welcome," George told his brother through intermediaries. "You made your choice. Now live with the consequences." Edward was allowed brief visits, always carefully scheduled to avoid media attention. But Fort Belvedere could never again serve as his home. The monarchy's relationship with the public evolved dramatically during and after the war. George VI and Elizabeth remained in London during the Blitz, refusing to evacuate even as German bombs fell nightly. Their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, stayed with them. "We are all in this together," the king said in radio addresses. "The palace is staying. We will endure what our people endure." This earned him enormous respect and affection. But the comparison with Edward was inescapable. Where was the former king during Britain's darkest hours? Safely in the Bahamas, governing a tropical backwater while his countrymen died. Where was Edward when London burned? Sunbathing and attending cocktail parties. The contrast between dutiful George and selfish Edward became a central narrative of British wartime propaganda. The good brother and the bad brother. The king who stayed and the king who ran away. Edward's reputation deteriorated further when captured German documents revealed the extent of his pro-Nazi sympathies. Hitler had apparently planned to reinstall Edward as a puppet king if Germany successfully invaded Britain. Edward and Wallis would have presided over a collaborationist regime, them following German orders while maintaining the pretense of British sovereignty. Whether Edward would have accepted such a role remains unclear. But the fact that the Nazis considered him amenable to it was damning enough. The monarchy survived, but not unchanged. George VI's early death in 1952, brought on partly by the stress of his unexpected kingship, meant his daughter Elizabeth became queen at age 25. She learned from her father's example and from her uncle's cautionary tale. Duty above all, service above self. Never complain, never explain. Maintain the dignity of the institution, even if it costs personal happiness. Queen Elizabeth II understood that the monarchy existed on sufferance. The public could withdraw their consent at any time. The institution survived because it provided stability, continuity, and ceremony that people valued. But if the royals became too expensive, and too scandalous, too obviously disconnected from ordinary life, the entire structure could collapse. Edward had brought the monarchy to the brink. Elizabeth's task was to pull it back and ensure it never came so close to dissolution again. Fort Belvedere represented everything Elizabeth wanted to forget. The building was a reminder that the monarchy was vulnerable, that one selfish individual could threaten the entire institution. She never visited the fort, never spoke of it publicly, never acknowledged its existence if she could avoid it. In her mind, and in the official narrative of the House of Windsor, Fort Belvedere didn't exist. It was a historical aberration, a mistake that had been corrected and needed no further examination. But the building itself refused to disappear. It stood in Windsor Great Park, visible to anyone who knew where to look. Its stones remembered. Its rooms held echoes of the conversations that had taken place there. The Abdication Crisis had begun at Fort Belvedere and ended there. The monarchy's fall from grace had its roots in Edward's obsessive cultivation of his personal sanctuary. Ignoring the fort didn't make it go away. It just made the silence more conspicuous, the denial more obvious. The monarchy had fallen. It had climbed back up. But the scars remained, hidden but not healed, in waiting for history to judge what had really happened during those dark years when a king chose love over duty and nearly destroyed the institution he was born to serve. Chapter 8: The Marriage of Scandal. In the wake of abdication, Wallace Simpson became more than Edward's lover. She became his only anchor in a sea of disgrace. They married on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Condé in France. The ceremony was small, attended by a handful of friends, so no member of the British royal family came. Edward's mother, Queen Mary, refused even to send a telegram. His brother, the new king, made clear that attendance would be considered an act of disloyalty to the crown. Edward wore a mourning suit. Wallace wore a pale blue dress by Mainbochet, elegant and understated. They exchanged vows before a makeshift altar in the chateau's drawing room. The marriage was everything they had sacrificed for, and yet it felt hollow. Edward had given up the throne to marry Wallace, but the throne was gone, and only Wallace remained. She was now his entire world, his purpose, his reason for existing. The pressure this placed on their relationship was immense and corrosive. No marriage could bear the weight of an abandoned empire. The British government denied Wallace the title Her Royal Highness. She would be the Duchess of Windsor, nothing more. Edward was furious. He had been promised that Wallace would receive proper recognition. He felt betrayed, humiliated. Wallace pretended not to care, but the snub wounded her deeply. She had upended her life, endured international condemnation, married a man who was now essentially unemployed and exiled. The least they could do was give her a proper title. The couple's life together quickly settled into a pattern of elegant aimlessness. They rented houses in France. They traveled to America and were briefly celebrated there as romantic figures who had defied convention. They threw parties and attended parties. They spent money freely, maintaining a lifestyle appropriate to their former status, even though Edward's income was limited to his investments and a grudging allowance from his brother. Fort Belvedere remained a point of contention. Edward wanted to return there, to resume the life he had built in the gardens and rooms he loved. But the palace refused. The British public wasn't ready to accept Wallace on English soil. Her presence would provoke protests, bad press, renewed debate about the abdication. Better that Edward and Wallis stay in France, out of sight and gradually out of mind. Wallis adapted to exile more easily than Edward. She had no deep attachment to Britain. She decorated their rented houses with the same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to Fort Belvedere. She entertained lavishly, and determined to prove that her rejection by British society didn't diminish her social standing. She surrounded herself with wealthy Americans and continental Europeans who treated her with the deference she craved. But Edward spiraled into depression. He had no role, no purpose, no country. He wrote letters to his family, begging for reconciliation. They went unanswered. He lobbied the British government for some official position, some way to serve. They politely declined. He was a former king, an embarrassment, a reminder of institutional failure. The best thing he could do for Britain was stay away and remain quiet. The marriage began to show strain. Wallis grew impatient with Edward's neediness. He required constant reassurance, constant attention, constant proof that she still loved him. She had signed up to be queen, or at least a respected royal consort. Instead, she was nursemaid to a depressed middle-aged man who had sacrificed everything and gained nothing. Her letters to friends hinted at regret. "If I had known what this would cost, would I have gone through with it?" she wrote to one confidant. "I sometimes wonder." Edward sensed her withdrawal and clung tighter. He showered her with gifts he could barely afford: jewelry, clothes, trips to expensive resorts. He tried to recreate the magic of their early relationship, the excitement of sneaking around, the thrill of forbidden love. But you can't recapture what exists only in memory. The reality of their situation was too stark. They were two people trapped together by a decision neither could undo, bound by a love that had cost them everything and delivered far less than promised. The Second World War provided temporary distraction. Edward's posting to the Bahamas gave him something to do, a governorship that required at least nominal attention. Wallis thrived there. She organized charity events. She redecorated Government House. She played the role of governor's wife with enthusiasm and skill. For a few years, they could pretend they had a normal life, a purpose beyond simply existing together. But the war ended. Edward's governorship ended. They returned to France and to the same hollow existence. Only now they were older, more obviously irrelevant. The world had moved on. The monarchy had survived without them. Britain was rebuilding under a Labour government that had no interest in a former king who had abandoned his duty. Edward and Wallis were historical footnotes, interesting for what they represented, but no longer important to contemporary events. Their marriage settled into a kind of armed truce. They maintained appearances in public. Photographers captured them at parties and premieres, always impeccably dressed, always smiling. But friends reported that they argued constantly in private. Wallis criticized Edward's drinking. Edward resented Wallis's social climbing. Both were disappointed by how their great love affair had devolved into tedious domesticity, marked by financial anxiety and social isolation. Fort Belvedere haunted their relationship. Edward spoke of it constantly. "Remember the gardens? Remember the swimming pool? Remember when we thought we could have everything?" Wallis grew tired of his nostalgia. The fort represented a past she wanted to escape, yet a reminder of the scandal that had defined her public image. She refused to accompany Edward on his rare visits back to Britain. She had no desire to see the place that had witnessed the beginning of her exile. the scandal of their marriage never fully abated. Every anniversary, the press ran retrospective articles. Was it worth it? Did Edward regret his choice? Was their love real, or had Wallis manipulated a weak man into destroying his own life? The couple never escaped these questions. They were frozen in public perception as the king who gave up everything for love and the woman who let him do it. In private, Edward admitted doubts. If he had refused to abdicate, would the government have eventually accepted Wallis? If he had waited, shown patience, would public opinion have shifted? He would never know. He had made his choice under pressure, believing he had no alternative. Now he had to live with consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. A marriage that was both his salvation and his prison. A woman he loved desperately, but whose presence reminded him daily of everything he had lost. Wallis had become his anchor. But anchors don't just keep you steady. They also keep you trapped, unable to move, unable to escape, sinking slowly into depths you can't quite fathom. Chapter 9. The Phantom Legacy of Fort Belvedere. Though the walls of Fort Belvedere remain standing, the monarchy's connection to it is a ghost of a once powerful legacy. After the war, Fort Belvedere existed in a strange limbo. Legally, it still belonged to the Crown estate, with Edward holding a long-term lease. But no one wanted to acknowledge its existence. The palace refused to discuss it. Edward rarely visited. The building sat largely empty, maintained by a skeleton staff who kept the gardens from complete wilderness and the rooms from total decay. The fort's architectural significance was obvious. It represented a particular moment in British aristocratic taste, the 18th century vogue for picturesque Gothic follies. Historians wanted to study it. Preservationists wanted to protect it. But any attempt to draw attention to Fort Belvedere inevitably raised uncomfortable questions about Edward and the abdication. So the building was ignored, allowed to fade from public consciousness while remaining physically intact. Local residents of Windsor knew about the fort. You could glimpse it from certain vantage points in the park, but it was off limits to the public. No tours, no access. The gates remained locked. Guards politely but firmly turned away anyone who approached. The message was clear. Fort Belvedere was not part of the official royal estate. It was a private residence that happened to sit on Crown land. Nothing to see. Move along. Edward died in 1972 at age 77, and he had spent 36 years in exile, never fully reconciled with his family, never finding a meaningful role. His final years were marked by illness and increasing isolation. Wallis nursed him through cancer, though by then their relationship had deteriorated into mutual dependence rather than genuine affection. When he died, she arranged for his body to be buried at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle. The Queen allowed this, a small gesture of family reconciliation. With Edward's death, and his lease on Fort Belvedere reverted to the Crown estate. The question became what to do with the building. Demolition was considered, but rejected as too controversial. Selling it to a private buyer would allow tabloids to run stories about the abdication every time the property changed hands. The solution was to lease it quietly to someone with no royal connections, someone who would maintain the property but keep a low profile. The fort was eventually leased to various tenants over the following decades. At one point, it housed a Saudi prince. Later, it was rented to a Canadian businessman. The lessees signed strict confidentiality agreements. They were forbidden from giving media interviews about the property. They couldn't host large parties or draw attention to themselves. Fort Belvedere was to remain a private residence, its historical significance deliberately suppressed. The gardens Edward had so lovingly created slowly changed. New tenants imposed their own tastes. Some of the original plantings were removed. The swimming pool was remodeled. The interiors were updated multiple times, stripping away the 1930s decor that Edward and Wallis had chosen. The building ceased to be a time capsule of the Abdication era and became just another country house, distinguished mainly by its unusual architecture. But the ghosts remained. Staff reported strange occurrences, footsteps in empty corridors, doors opening on their own, the scent of Wallis's perfume drifting through rooms. These were likely imagination and old pipes rather than genuine hauntings. But they spoke to the building's psychological weight. Fort Belvedere was a place where history had pivoted, where personal choices had reshaped an institution. That kind of significance doesn't evaporate simply because new tenants move in and repaint the walls. The British monarchy's relationship with Fort Belvedere settled into deliberate amnesia. Official histories of the royal family mention the building only in passing, if at all. Tours of Windsor Castle and the surrounding estate carefully avoided any route that would make the fort visible. When the Queen's press office received inquiries about Fort Belvedere, they responded with terse statements. "It's a private residence. We have no comment." The strategy was to wait for public interest to fade, for the abdication to become ancient history, for Fort Belvedere to be forgotten. But forgetting proved difficult. The abdication remained the most dramatic moment in 20th century royal history. Biographies of Edward and Wallis appeared regularly, each one revisiting the events at Fort Belvedere. Television documentaries examined the constitutional crisis from every angle, yet historians debated whether Edward had been forced out or chosen exile. And always, Fort Belvedere featured in these narratives as the physical setting for the drama. The building became a symbol with meanings that shifted depending on perspective. For romantic idealists, Fort Belvedere represented love triumphant over duty, a place where a king chose his heart over his crown. For monarchists, it symbolized dereliction and betrayal, a monument to selfish indulgence. For architectural historians, it was a fine example of Gothic revival styling. For the royal family, it was an embarrassment they wished would simply disappear. Wallis outlived Edward by 14 years. She spent those years in increasing isolation, her mind deteriorating, her body failing. She died in 1986 and was buried next to Edward at Frogmore. With her death, the last direct link to the Abdication Crisis was severed. Everyone who had witnessed the events at Fort Belvedere was gone. All that remained were documents, photographs, and the building itself. The fort stands today, still leased to private tenants, still off limits to the public. From certain angles in Windsor Great Park, you can see its towers rising above the trees. The building looks solid, permanent, unchanged, but its legacy has faded to phantom status. The monarchy survived Edward's abdication. It adapted and evolved. Queen Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years, restoring public faith in the institution. Her successors inherited a monarchy vastly different from the one Edward knew. Fort Belvedere has become irrelevant to contemporary royal life. The current generation barely remembers the abdication. Edward and Wallis are historical figures, not living memories. The scandal that once threatened to destroy the monarchy has been absorbed into its long, complex history. One crisis among many. One building among dozens. Nothing special, nothing worth preserving beyond its architectural merit. But the phantom legacy persists. Fort Belvedere remains a reminder that the monarchy is fragile, that individuals can damage institutions, that personal choices have public consequences. The walls may stand for centuries more. The gardens may continue to bloom. But the fort's true significance exists not in stone and soil, but in the collective memory of a nation that watched its king choose love over duty and had to reckon with what that choice revealed about power, privilege, and the price of following your heart when the world demands you sacrifice it instead. Chapter 10. The Windsors' Silence. The Windsors chose silence over redemption, an enduring decision that echoes across history. Queen Elizabeth II reigned from 1952 to 2022. 7 decades on the throne. 7 decades during which she could have addressed the Abdication Crisis, acknowledged Fort Belvedere, reconciled the monarchy with its recent past. She chose not to. The silence was deliberate and strategic. Never complain, never explain. That was her motto. Especially don't explain Uncle David. The decision to maintain silence about Edward and Fort Belvedere was not made lightly. Elizabeth's advisors debated the issue repeatedly over the years. Some argued for transparency, publish the documents, open the archives, let historians examine what really happened and why. Others insisted that secrecy was essential. The abdication remained a sore point with older Britons. Why remind them? Why give ammunition to Republicans who argued the monarchy was outdated? Better to let sleeping scandals lie. Elizabeth sided with silence. She met with Edward occasionally during his exile, these formal encounters carefully orchestrated to avoid emotional scenes. She attended his funeral and Wallis's funeral, fulfilling family obligations without warmth or enthusiasm. She never spoke publicly about her uncle beyond brief, anodyne statements. He made his choice. We respect it. The monarchy moved on. That was the extent of her commentary. This silence extended to Fort Belvedere. The building was never included in official royal estate tours. When pressed by journalists, us palace spokespeople gave minimal responses. It's privately leased. We have no involvement. The implication was clear. Fort Belvedere was not part of the royal story the monarchy wanted to tell. It was an unfortunate footnote, best left unexamined. The British public largely accepted this erasure. By the 1970s and 80s, most people had more immediate concerns than a king who had abdicated 40 years earlier. The economy was struggling. Social norms were changing. The monarchy's relevance was questioned for reasons having nothing to do with Edward. The abdication became historical trivia, something mentioned in school lessons but not deeply examined. Wallis's death in 1986 could have prompted reassessment. Instead, it reinforced the silence. The Queen attended the funeral but made no speech. No official retrospective was commissioned. The press ran obligatory obituaries, then moved on to other news. Wallis and Edward were buried together at Frogmore, their graves marked with simple stones. Even in death, they remained separate from the main royal family, tucked away in a corner of the estate. The Crown Estate continued to lease Fort Belvedere to private tenants. The lessees changed periodically. Each new tenant was vetted carefully to ensure they understood the sensitivity of the property. No media access, no public events, no attempts to capitalize on the building's connection to the abdication. The tenants agreed, signed their contracts, and moved in. Fort Belvedere became just another expensive country house, distinguished mainly by its unusual architectural style and its location within Windsor Great Park. But silence has consequences. By refusing to engage with the abdication crisis, the monarchy allowed others to control the narrative. Novelists wrote fictional accounts that took liberties with historical facts. Filmmakers produced movies that sensationalized the romance while ignoring the political complexity. Popular historians offered simplified explanations that cast Edward and Wallis as either tragic heroes or selfish villains, with little nuance. The true story, messy and complicated and human, was lost in the noise. Edward wasn't a hero or a villain. He was a weak man placed in an impossible situation. It's someone who chose personal happiness because he couldn't imagine living without it. Wallis wasn't a manipulative seductress or a great romantic figure. She was an ambitious woman who got caught up in events beyond her control and paid a steep price for her association with a king. Fort Belvedere was central to their story. It was where Edward courted Wallis, where he made the decision to abdicate, where he signed the documents that ended his reign. The building witnessed the entire crisis unfold. But by refusing to acknowledge Fort Belvedere's significance, the monarchy allowed it to be mythologized, reduced to a symbol rather than understood as a place where real people made real choices with lasting consequences. Queen Elizabeth's grandson, Prince William, represents a new generation with different attitudes toward transparency. He has spoken more openly about royal struggles with mental health, about the difficulties of life under constant scrutiny. But even he has not addressed the abdication. Fort Belvedere remains off limits. The archives remain closed. The silence continues. This ongoing silence raises questions about what the monarchy fears. Is it worried that examining the abdication too closely would undermine public support? Does it believe that acknowledging Edward's Nazi sympathies would taint the entire institution? Is it simply stubborn institutional inertia, a continuation of Elizabeth's policy because no one has bothered to reconsider it? Whatever the reason, the effect is the same. Fort Belvedere exists in historical purgatory, not forgotten, because too many books and documentaries mention it, but not acknowledged because the monarchy refuses to engage with what happened there. The building stands as a monument to silence, to the royal family's decision that some chapters of their history are better left unread, some rooms better left locked, some questions better left unanswered. The silence is not neutral. It is an active choice that shapes how we understand the monarchy and its past. By refusing to confront Fort Belvedere and what it represents, the Windsors have created a void that others fill with speculation and myth. They have surrendered control over a narrative that fundamentally shaped the modern monarchy. They have chosen preservation of reputation over honest accounting of history. And in doing so, they have ensured that Fort Belvedere will remain a symbol of everything the monarchy would rather not discuss. A reminder that silence, however strategic, is itself a form of communication, one that says more than any carefully crafted statement ever could. Chapter 11. The Royal Guilt. A century later, the guilt lingers, not just with Edward, but with the monarchy that was forced to live with his choices. Edward never fully recovered from his decision to abdicate. Friends who visited him in exile reported that he would sometimes stare out windows for hours, lost in thought. He wrote letters to family members that mixed defiance with regret. "I had no choice," he would insist. And then, pages later, "Did I make a terrible mistake?" The contradiction defined his post-abdication life. He needed to believe he had chosen correctly while suspecting he had destroyed his own future. The guilt manifested in obsessive reminiscence. He talked constantly about his time as king, those 11 months before the abdication. He described ceremonies he had performed, visits he had made, moments when he had felt the weight and importance of his position. He was trying to convince himself and anyone who would listen that walking away had been worth it. But the more he talked, the less convinced he sounded. Wallis bore her own guilt. She told friends that if she had known what Edward would sacrifice, she would have ended their relationship. "I never wanted him to give up the throne," she insisted. "I thought we could find another way." But she had encouraged the relationship. She had accepted his gifts and his attention. She had allowed herself to become central to his emotional life. Whether she intended the outcome or not, she was complicit in the crisis that followed. Their marriage was haunted by mutual recrimination. Edward blamed Wallis for not being worth the sacrifice. She blamed him for making a sacrifice she hadn't asked for. Both blamed the royal family for not being more accommodating. Both blamed the British public for not accepting their love. The guilt swirled between them like smoke, never fully dissipating, always obscuring clear vision of what had actually happened and why. For the broader royal family, the guilt was institutional rather than personal. George VI felt it acutely. He had been thrust into kingship unprepared and forced to clean up the mess Edward created. His stutter, which had plagued him since childhood, worsened under the stress. He worked himself into exhaustion, trying to prove he was worthy of the crown his brother had discarded. The strain contributed to his early death at age 56. Queen Mary, Edward, and George's mother carried perhaps the deepest guilt. She blamed herself for not being a warmer, more affectionate parent. If I had shown Edward more love, would he have been less desperate for Wallis's affection? She wondered in private letters. She died in 1953, having outlived her husband by 17 years, but never fully coming to terms with Edward's choices. The guilt extended through generations. Queen Elizabeth II grew up watching her parents struggle with the abdication's aftermath. She saw how her father's health deteriorated under the unexpected burden of kingship. She understood that her own position resulted from Edward's failure. Would she have become queen if her uncle had remained on the throne? Almost certainly not. Her entire life was shaped by someone else's guilt and shame. This generational trauma influenced how Elizabeth approached her own reign. She was determined never to put personal desire above duty. She married Philip and remained married despite difficulties, because divorce would remind people of Edward and Wallis. She maintained a grueling schedule of public appearances well into old age, because stepping back might seem like abdication. She never spoke candidly about her feelings or opinions, because Edward's emotional honesty had been his undoing. Fort Belvedere became a physical manifestation of this collective guilt. The building stood as evidence that the abdication had really happened, that it wasn't just a bad dream the family could wake up from. Every time a family member drove past the fort, visible through the trees, they were reminded, Uncle David was here. This is where it happened. This is where the monarchy nearly ended. The royal family's refusal to visit Fort Belvedere was partly practical, but it was also psychological avoidance. Going there would mean confronting the guilt directly. Better to pretend the building didn't exist. Better to keep driving, eyes forward, focused on maintaining the institution Edward had damaged. The guilt also manifested in how the family treated Edward during his exile. They provided him with a financial allowance, fulfilling their obligation, but they kept him at emotional distance, rarely visiting, seldom writing. This was partly punishment, but it was also self-protection. Being around Edward meant feeling the guilt afresh. Easier to maintain separation, to let him fade into the background of their lives. Maya Edward's funeral in 1972 forced the family to confront what they had tried to ignore. His body lay in state at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Thousands of people filed past to pay respects. Many were older Britons who remembered Edward as the charming Prince of Wales, the golden boy who had seemed to represent modernity and hope. His abdication had disappointed them deeply, but time had softened some of the anger. He had chosen love, after all. In an age becoming more skeptical of duty and tradition, that choice seemed less shameful than it once had. The Queen attended the funeral and wept, not from sorrow at Edward's death necessarily, but from the release of decades of accumulated guilt and resentment and confusion about what his choices had meant for her family and her own life. She had spent 20 years as queen living in the shadow of the abdication, proving daily that the monarchy could survive, that duty could triumph over desire. Edward's death meant that chapter was finally closing. The relief was palpable, but guilt doesn't end with death. It passes down through families like genetic inheritance. Prince Charles grew up hearing stories about Uncle David, the cautionary tale of what happened when royals prioritized personal happiness. The lesson was clear. Don't be like Edward. Put duty first. Sacrifice your desires for the institution. Charles struggled with this directive throughout his life, particularly regarding his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. He loved Camilla but married Diana because she was deemed more suitable. The marriage was miserable and ended in divorce. Charles had tried to avoid Edward's mistake. Instead, he created his own version of it. The pattern repeated. William and Harry, Charles's sons, learned about their great-grand-uncle's abdication. They understood it as family trauma, a wound that had never fully healed. Harry eventually chose a version of Edward's path, stepping back from royal duties to pursue happiness with his American wife. The parallels were obvious and painful. History wasn't repeating, but it was echoing. Fort Belvedere continues to stand in Windsor Great Park, a stone reminder that guilt built on personal choice and institutional pressure doesn't fade with time. It transforms. It affects new generations in different ways, but it persists. The monarchy lives with Edward's choices still, not as actively as in the 1930s and 40s, but as a lingering sense that the institution is fragile, that individual desires can threaten collective stability, that the price of keeping the crown is eternal vigilance against the human impulse to choose love over duty. The guilt remains, unspoken mostly, but present in every decision about transparency and privacy, about duty and happiness, about whether the monarchy can ever truly reconcile with its most painful chapter, or must simply carry the burden forward, hoping time will eventually provide the absolution that acknowledgement cannot. Chapter 12. The Cost of Dreams. Fort Belvedere still stands as a monument, not to grandeur, but to the cost of a dream that shattered an empire. The building exists today as it has for nearly 3 centuries. golden stone weathered by British rain, towers reaching toward changeable skies, gardens that bloom each spring regardless of the human dramas that have unfolded within view. Fort Belvedere endures while the people who gave it meaning have all passed into history. Edward, Wallace, George, Elizabeth, all gone. Only the fort remains. Current tenants maintain the property according to the terms of their lease. The rooms are furnished in contemporary style, bearing no resemblance to the 1930s decor that Edward and Wallis chose, and the swimming pool Edward installed has been remodeled multiple times. The gardens he planted have been redesigned to suit different tastes. The building is well cared for, but it has been stripped of the elements that made it specifically Edward's sanctuary. It is a house now, not a monument, not a museum, just a very expensive private residence that happens to occupy a footnote in British history. But monuments don't require plaques or preservation orders. Sometimes they exist in collective memory, in the stories we tell about ambition and sacrifice, about love and duty, about the price of choosing your own happiness over the expectations others have placed on you. Fort Belvedere is that kind of monument. The building matters less than what it represents. Edward's dream was simple at its core. He wanted to be himself. He wanted to love freely and be loved in return. He wanted a life that felt authentic rather than performed. And these are universal desires, not particularly shocking or unreasonable. But Edward was not a universal person. He was a king, and kings, the institution insisted, could not indulge universal desires. Kings had to sacrifice, to sublimate, to subordinate personal happiness to duty. Edward refused. He chose the dream over the crown, and the cost was everything he thought the crown would provide: security, purpose, connection to something larger than himself. He gained Wallace, but lost the empire. He gained freedom, but lost meaning. The transaction seemed fair when he signed the abdication documents. It seemed less fair during the long decades of exile that followed. Wallace's dream was equally straightforward. She wanted status and financial security. She wanted to matter, to be seen, to escape the middle-class anonymity she associated with failure. Edward offered all of that. But the price was steeper than she anticipated. She gained a duke, but lost any chance of widespread acceptance. She gained wealth, but spent it in isolation from the society she most wanted to join. She became famous, but as an object of scandal rather than admiration. The monarchy's dream, if institutions can be said to dream, was stability and continuity. It wanted to pass seamlessly from George V to Edward VIII, to whatever heirs Edward produced. It wanted public confidence and political irrelevance, the sweet spot where royalty provides ceremony without threatening democracy. In Edward's abdication shattered that dream. The monarchy survived, but scarred. It learned it was vulnerable. It learned individual choices could threaten institutional survival. It became more cautious, more conservative, more determined to prevent any future Edward from emerging. Fort Belvedere was the physical setting where these dreams collided and destroyed each other. Edward dreamed of freedom and found prison. Wallace dreamed of status and found exile. The monarchy dreamed of stability and found chaos. The building witnessed all of it: the courtship, the abdication, the aftermath. Its walls absorbed the hopes and disappointments of everyone who walked through them. The broader lesson Fort Belvedere offers is about the incompatibility of certain dreams with certain positions. Edward wanted to be a regular person with normal desires. But he wasn't a regular person. He was born into extraordinary circumstances that came with extraordinary constraints. His attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable led to disaster, not because he was evil or because Wallace was manipulative, but because some dreams are mutually exclusive. You can be a king who does his duty, or you can be a man who follows his heart. Edward tried to be both and ended up being neither. This truth extends beyond monarchy. Anyone in a position of power or responsibility faces similar tensions. How much personal happiness can you sacrifice for professional success? How much of yourself can you subordinate to institutional demands before you lose your identity entirely? These are questions without clear answers. Edward chose one path. His brother George chose another. Both men paid prices for their choices. George died young from stress-induced illness. Edward died in exile from purposelessness-induced despair. Fort Belvedere stands as a reminder that every choice forecloses other possibilities. When Edward signed the abdication documents at the fort, he closed off the future where he was a dutiful king. But he also closed off the future where he remained perpetually unfulfilled, trapped in a loveless arranged marriage, performing a role he never truly wanted. The question is not whether he made the right choice. The question is whether any choice in that situation could have been right. In the building's current obscurity is fitting. Fort Belvedere doesn't deserve to be a grand tourist attraction with gift shops and guided tours. That would commercialize tragedy, turn profound human struggle into entertainment. Better that it remains private, accessible only to those who lease it and those who study its history seriously. Better that most people forget it exists. Better that it fades into the landscape of Windsor Great Park, one more architectural curiosity with a complicated past. But for those who remember, for those who understand what happened there, Fort Belvedere retains power. It speaks to the eternal tension between individual desire and collective responsibility. It reminds us that love, however genuine, cannot solve every problem or justify every decision. It demonstrates that sacrifice, whether of duty for love or love for duty, extracts a price from everyone involved. The cost of Edward's dream was measured in concrete terms. He lost the throne. He lost his family's respect. He lost his purpose and his country. But the cost was also measured in less tangible ways. He lost the opportunity to shape history as king. He lost the chance to prove that monarchy could adapt to modern sensibilities. He lost the possibility of being remembered as a reformer rather than an abdicator. Wallis's cost was equally steep. She lost her reputation. She lost the possibility of being genuinely loved by Edward rather than being his obsession. She lost the chance to be known as anything other than the woman who destroyed a king. Her name became synonymous with scandal. History reduced her to a villain or a victim, rarely acknowledging her as a complete person with agency and complexity. The monarchy's cost was institutional trauma that persists generations later. It lost the easy assumption of permanence. It gained knowledge of its own fragility. It became more rigid, more defensive, more afraid of change. Whether this made it stronger or weaker remains debatable. Fort Belvedere stands as testimony to all these costs. The building's stones don't care about human drama. They simply endure, as stones do. But the meaning we project onto those stones matters. Fort Belvedere is not just a house. It is the physical manifestation of a historical moment when a king chose his heart over his crown and discovered that some choices, once made, can never be unmade. that some dreams, once pursued, cost more than we can afford to pay. That some monuments commemorate not glory, but the terrible price of wanting things that life, circumstances, and duty have placed forever beyond our reach.